Welcome boys and girls, Costini here with a discussion about the best Legendary Lord campaigns for every single race in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empire. Starting with the Beastmen is clearly Taurox. The reason it is Taurox is he's the only Beastman Legendary Lord that has unique campaign mechanics. Others may have skill lines, may have faction effects, but they don't have unique campaign mechanics. So that is an edge that Taurox has versus the others. And those campaign mechanics give him campaign movement range from momentum. They also give him a bunch of combat benefits or recruitment benefits. So hero capacity, unit recruitment benefits. Taurox does have that going for him in his campaign, which is actually really good for a Beastman because Beastmen can certainly be pretty slow in terms of build-up. Taurox will just handle the build-up better. For Bretonia, it is Rapunz the Leoness. Rapunz doesn't have the same issues that all the other Bretonian campaigns do have. First off, she has a much better situation due to her starting location with the vows. So if you want to get questing vows done in a campaign, Rapunz is the best campaign of the Bretonians to do so. She also has a much better starting province than the other Bretonian campaigns because Bretonia in itself is not that great. And Lustria is not that great for Albrecht, though funnily enough I would actually say Albrecht has a really good campaign situation if not for the Illustrian problem, because he does have that recruitment benefit for Bretonian Knights of -1 so that he can recruit Bretonian Knights faster than in the other campaigns. But undeniably so, due to a combination of faction effects and starting position, as well as the research situation that Rapunz has to deal with and her confederation situation, Rapunz ends up being the best Bretonian Legendary Lord. For the Cast Dwarves, well, this is a bit of an interesting one. So if you're looking to play a short campaign, and if you're looking to have a good amount of early game power and a safe starting position, then Astrogoth is certainly the choice for it, because he has a relatively safe starting province, he gets more heroes than the others early on, and that gives him a whole bunch of different advantages. But I would dare say that the best campaign for the Cast Dwarves is Draz of Ashen. A really interesting starting position, a really powerful mage melee lord with a good amount of flexibility because of his flying capability in a campaign. Basically, both Astrogoth and Drazov are worth playing. Zaytan is not. Zaytan is good as a Legendary Lord. This is the starting situation of his campaign and the objectives of the campaign that end up hurting him quite a bit. For Daniel, well, it is Daniel. Though I would dare say Daniel is not worth playing. For the Dark Elves, here's the situation for the Dark Elves. If you're looking at playing a short campaign or a fast-paced campaign, then Lokir ends up dominating quite a bit compared to the other Dark Elves. The reasons behind this: one, he has more black arcs than anyone else, so that is certainly an advantage and means that unlike all the other Dark Elves, you don't have to spend a lot of time to unlock multiple black arcs. On top of that, with the sacrifice to an Afrema as opposed to the black arc right, you end up with some very substantial benefits in combat and in terms of economy very early on in his campaign. It is extremely powerful. But if you're looking at playing a longer campaign as the Dark Elves, then I would dare say Morathi is really the choice. The Silential Corruption benefit does end up working quite well for her. Her starting positions, the dynamics of her starting position, the sheer amount of things she can get done very quickly, and long-term, crucially, in her campaign are pretty ridiculous. Not as good in the early game as Lokir, but much better in a long campaign than Lokir from my point of view. For the Dwarves, well, there's really only one choice, and that is, of course, Malachi McCason. Really fun starting position, really dynamic starting position that he has to deal with. Those adventures do work out very well for him, and a whole bunch of different combat benefits throughout the course of his campaign. So it does end up work. If you want an easy campaign, though, for the Dwarves, and really one that's focused more than even Malachi on empire building, then Grombrindle is really your choice. And not for anything that's shown on the screen. So there's two reasons Grombrindle is so good. His blue skill line gives him more campaign movement range than all the other dwarves or most other Legendary Lords in any campaign that's faction-wide. He gets recruitment benefits, he gets campaign movement range benefits, he gets casualty replenishment benefits, and on top of that, he does get a benefit with the Ancestor Gods, which gives him replenishment benefit, control benefits, construction benefits, or combat benefits if you choose to go for it. So Grombrindle ends up being pretty damn ridiculous when you start playing his campaign. So if you want to build a massive empire quickly, without really too much worry, Grombrindle is the choice, but if you really want a fun and dynamic campaign, I would say Malachi is the choice to go for. For the empire is Karl Franz. Gelt and Elspeth do have really good armies of either casters or ranged units, or though Elspeth can get a good amount of casters as well, and a significant amount of winds and magic benefits in her situation. Gelt is all about mages and a really ridiculous starting position. But I think Karl Franz just has the most dynamic campaign of the Empire. A lot of campaign power available to him through the Emperor's decrees that he can then improve. He's also the only Legendary Lord of the Empire that can guarantee confederation with other Legendary Lords, which makes for a far more interesting campaign in the long term. In the early game, yeah, Elspeth and Gelt can be better, but I think Karl Franz just has a far more interesting campaign to play in general. For Grand Cathay, now to some extent, it should really be Jan Bo, because he does have the most amount of power. He does have a better climate situation in his campaign than the other Cathay and Legendary Lords, so that ends up working for him quite a bit. He also gets more Astromancers than the others. However, Jan Bo's Lustria focus is not an especially interesting one from my perspective. Like, the faction effects work, the action mechanics certainly work, but on the flip side, you can also just as easily argue, or very strongly argue, in favor of Xiao Ming. The reason I would argue in favor of Xiao Ming, he does have that caravan benefit in his campaign, though you can get that as a lord effect if you do confederate him. He has a benefit to Ogre Mercenaries, which is now actually very useful. He has an armor benefit for melee units, which works on a faction-wide level. So Xiao Ming actually ends up dominating Cathay in a way that Miao Ying or Yan Bo simply can't early on. So might be better for a fast-paced campaign, whereas Yan Bo is better from a strength perspective in a longer campaign and a climate perspective. But yeah, I can't really say that Yan Bo's campaign focus is really that great. The power's there, it's just how great it is to play. Then we get into the greenskins. Well, isn't this an interesting discussion? So, I think that Grimgor is the clear winner in this respect. He gets more Black Orcs, he has a Black Orc focus, he gets unique upgrades for the Black Orcs, so all of that kind of stuff does end up working quite well. An alternative would be Skarsnik, with his focus on getting armies with stock stands once he gets Character 8 peaks, and a whole bunch of benefits with respect to goblins and squig units, character experience gain for heroes. It may take a while to build up, but once you do build up, it is fairly ridiculous. You can also argue in favor of Gorbad, but it's less about the faction effects, and more so that Gorbad is actually a good Legendary Lord in terms of his Lord effects, his special skill line, his starting position is quite fun and interesting. So here's my perspective. From an early game perspective, I think Gorbad is pretty interesting and pretty fun. From a longer game perspective, Skarsnik is really good as well, though not necessarily the best early game situation. And Grimgor is kind of like that really sweet middle spot between them, because he can have a very strong and powerful and interesting early game, but he also has a ridiculously powerful late game. Partly because he has the easiest time to conquer Zarnagrund, and well, just having plus 30% post-battle loot is a hell of a benefit, as is the ability of recruiting Black Orc big bosses across your entire empire. Then we get into the High Elves. Ooh, this is an interesting discussion on the High Elves. So, from a short campaign perspective, I dare argue that the Lifanar is the most interesting campaign to play of the Dark Elves. Well, okay, his first few turns are going to be pretty easy, but when you're looking at short campaign objectives, when you're looking at beating up the Dark Elves, dealing with Malekith, Lifanar does get things done. That said, the most powerful Legendary Lord of the High Elves is absolutely Alariel. She gets more Handmaidens than everyone else, and Handmaidens are just simply ridiculous. And she can basically get the Sword of Cain with all the benefits of the Sword of Cain and nullify all the downsides of the Sword of Cain fairly easily in her campaign. Others just don't compare, but truthfully, the problems with the High Elves are not necessarily so much their Legendary Lords. Elfarian has some issues with his campaign dynamic, techless is techless, but the issues of the High Elves have more to do with their race as opposed to the Legendary Lords themselves. Alarielle has problems in her campaign, but once you deal with those in the early game, she is ridiculously strong. For Khorne is Arbble the Undefeated. Really fun, dynamic campaign with a focus on mortal units, and mortal units, especially mortal infantry units, are just better than demonic infantry units. Suffice to say, when you're looking at Chosen versus Exalted Bloodletters, Chosen end up winning. Wrathmongers end up winning. Skull Reapers end up winning. And Arbble has the great benefit of having a global recruitment and duration -1 turn for all units in his army. He also has a bunch of mortal benefits as well in his skill line. So I think like Arbble compared to Skulltaker especially is much better. Skullbrand is not too bad, but yeah, I think Arbble is really the best one to play. Like just mortal units end up working better than demonic units at the moment in a campaign, and Arbble is all about those mortal units, and I think having that kind of global objective system that he does have to work with makes his campaigns far more interesting than others. Then we have Kislev. Boris ends up winning. He has a better climate situation, a better fashion effect situation. He can get supporters better than either Cautrin or Castalton. And the kind of construction benefits that he does have, including free colonization through his skill line, makes Boris really good and really strong. As an alternative, you can argue strongly in favor of Astankia, unique research, buffs and debuffs for your army. She won't be good at building. She won't be as good as building an empire as Boris will be, but she certainly has a combat ability that is easily the strongest combat ability in a Kislev campaign. For what it's worth, I do find dealing with her unique campaign systems frustrating, but her new starting position certainly does work, and while her climate is not as good as Boris, she's pretty close to it. Just don't bother with Catra and Castalton, it's not really worth it. Lizardman, there's only really one campaign of the Lizardman that is worth a damn, and it is Oxyatl. A very dynamic campaign across the world with those kind of objectives across the world, bunch of different rewards. While Oxyatl doesn't make up for the deficiencies that Lizardmen do have as a race, he does certainly go a long way. At least in terms of unit recruitment and having a very dynamic campaign and not being stuck in a jungle, which is a really good situation that he has to deal with. And I don't think there's any alternative that comes even close, remotely close to what Oxyatl has to provide in a campaign. Norska, I would probably argue in favor of Trog as opposed to Wulfric. I think Trog's troll focus does end up working quite well for him. He also starts with a better province, he starts with a better army situation than Wulfric, and furthermore, he also has that casualty replenishment as a starting hero as opposed to what Wulfric has to deal with. Poor Wulfric. Nurgle. Well, if you're looking to play a Nurgle campaign focused on plagues, I would recommend Fists from the Warriors of Chaos. So that disqualifies Epidemius especially. Kugaf does have stronger plagues than the other ones, but really the best Nurgle campaign is Tamarkan. The chieftains themselves, the unique units, the unique benefits that those chieftains do provide are really strong and really fun to use. All Nurgle campaigns do have similar issues in terms of how limited it can be, especially with regards to mountain climate, but I think Tamarkan is in the best situation out of all the Nurgle campaigns. Ogres! Now, this is a tricky one because there's not necessarily a best ogre campaign. It depends on the focus you want to have in your campaign. With Greases, you're certainly focused on empire building. You do have that benefit. You get more money than all the other ogres to a degree. Or at least you get more money for regular settlements, not objectives. And you also have a bunch of benefits with using that money in his campaign. Scrag is all about gaining meat from battles in a longer campaign, not necessarily early on, and having a very dynamic starting position because he is in the border princes, and so he has the balance, he has the empire, he has Estalia, he has Tylea, he has Bretonia. He has all kinds of different choices and interesting ones on all sides. He's also the best caster faction in the game with the kind of benefits that he can unlock. Then we have Maneater. Maneater is all about the contracts. He's all about having a dynamic campaign across the world with all those kind of objectives, sweet money, sweet meat. Who would I pick personally? I think Maneater does end up winning for me personally, but I do think there's significant benefits in both Crix and Scrag. So I think Creative Assembly did a fine job with the Ogre rework and making all of them very viable. For the Skaven, well, if you want strong individual unit customization, then Front Clean does provide that with his unique campaign mechanic. If you want nuclear weapons, you can go with Ikaclaw. The problem for both Front and Ikaclaw is that while the faction mechanics do work and they're pretty powerful and they do end up working in a long campaign, I think the early game does end up suffering quite a bit for it. So from my point of view, I would personally choose Snitch. So it's one of these 3 Legendary Lords. They all have unique campaign mechanics, but all of which are pretty strong, very solid and well designed. But I do prefer Snitch because he does just have that better early game situation to deal with than the others, while still having a huge amount of long-term faction potential. For Slaanesh, it's of course Slaanesh. Tomb King wise, I think the only campaign worth playing as the Tomb Kings is Archon the Black, and purely because he gets that extra army capacity from the beginning of the campaign, so he actually has a more interesting campaign or more tools to deal with the situation in his campaign from very early on. But to be sure, Tomb Kings do have a lot of issues, especially Katep. Caligida's not that great. Cetra has his issues. Like, Cetra is better at building a massive empire if you're willing to tolerate that shitty early game. But Archon is just better overall throughout the course of a campaign from my perspective. For Siege, yeah, it's Kairos versus the Changeling. I would pick Kairos, but Siege is not that great of a race to play at the moment. But yeah, if you're looking to play a Siege campaign, I would just say don't play Siege, but play Kairos. He does get that 33% construction time for all buildings, which can work out. But I just don't think Siege is that great of a race to play at the moment in any way. Then we get to Vampire Coast. I am going to argue in favor of Aranessa. The reason I'm going to argue in favor of Aranessa boils down to this. She gets Man-Eaters. She gets Man-Eaters with Ogre Pistols. If you do have the Ogre DLC, she gets Sartosa Militia. The fundamental issue that the Vampire Coast has is that the vast majority of their units that they can recruit are not really great. Aranessa makes up for it. On top of that, she does have that 20% income from stacking settlements faction-wide, which does improve her economy quite a bit in her campaign. The enemy she's dealing with, well, let's just say Noctilus may have to deal with High Elves. Noctilus may end up being stronger later on, though I think a lot of people exaggerate. Oh, Necrofex Colossi are very strong. Yeah, Necrofex Colossi are overrated as a unit from my perspective. Noctilus's power doesn't necessarily come from Necrofex Colossi, actually. Noctilus's power comes from his War Declaration benefits, as well as the sheer amount of power he personally can have in combat as a Legendary Lord. Like, Aranessa's weakness is that she's not really the best in combat as a Legendary Lord. I mean, Luthor initially is not that great either, but he can be. Noctilus just inherently is really strong. Strong in melee, strong as a caster. He does start with a better Horde army than the others, but he also has the most annoying starting situation of a Vampire Coast campaign. Personally, I recommend Aranessa, but, you know, that's just because of the sacking income and being able to get Man-Eaters in a campaign. Vampire counts, Vlad or Isabella. Pick your poison. It's the same campaign, just different faction effects. For what it's worth, I think Isabella is better because she does get the extra hero capacity for vampires. And having Vlad as a legendary hero means he starts with his items unlocked as opposed to you having to earn them. And that is a pretty powerful situation to deal with in a campaign. Lord effects don't matter between the two of them because you're going to get those Lord effects anyway with the other one as a legendary hero, but that weapon strength and the hero capacity for vampires is very strong for Isabella. But to be sure, Vlad does get shit done. Don't get me wrong on that. And both of them have the exact same starting position. It's just the kind of faction effects you're willing to go for. Warriors of Chaos, it will be Be'lakor. I think Be'lakor has the most dynamic campaign of the Warriors of Chaos. He does have the teleportation. He has no limit on gifted units in his campaign, and he ends up working the best from that point of view. You want to make an army of Dragon Ogre Shaggoths, Be'lakor is your choice. You want to confederate all the other legendary lords of the Warriors of Chaos, only Archaon can do it as well, and Archaon is just not as good early on as Be'lakor can be. So a far more dynamic and interesting campaign than all the others. And it's available to everyone. For Wood Elves, well, the strongest is Orion, without a doubt, because free upkeep is free upkeep, right? So that is a significant level of power that Orion has. Dorfu is really good at leading treatment, and he's the only legendary lord that gets all those events to confederate the other legendary lords of the Wood Elves. Sisters of Twilight have Flying Doomstack available only to their campaign and the Forge of Dave. And Draika has the Malevolent Treekin units available in her campaign. Well, who would I pick? Well, I don't think any of the Wood Elves are really that great to play at the moment, but I'd either pick Sisters or Draika. I think while Orion is certainly very strong, I think Sisters and Draika just have a better and more interesting campaign situation to deal with overall. But as my perspective, Questine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.